The icy wind cut through the narrow streets as John Marshall pulled his tattered coat tighter around his frail body. The world had long forgotten him, a veteran of wars fought decades ago, now reduced to a nameless shadow wandering the city. His stomach churned with hunger, the kind that gnaws at your insides, relentless and unforgiving. He had grown accustomed to it, but today it felt unbearable. As he stumbled along the sidewalk, his eyes landed on the small, warmly lit storefront of a bakery. The scent of fresh bread wafted through the air, pulling him in like a siren's call. Desperation edged his steps as he pushed open the door and stepped inside. The warmth hit him like a wall, momentarily stunning him. He stood there, taking in the rows of pastries and loaves, each one more inviting than the last. "Hey, you can't be in here." The sharp voice of the bakery attendant cut through the haze of hunger. She was young, tired, and in no mood for charity. John opened his mouth to speak, but the words caught in his throat. All he wanted was a scrap, something to quiet the gnawing pain. But before he could plead his case, she was on him, her face twisted in irritation. "Get out now. We don't serve your kind here." John hesitated, the humiliation stinging more than the cold outside. But as he turned to leave, the bell above the door jingled, announcing the entrance of another customer. Dr. Emily Walker, bundled in a thick coat, stepped inside, her eyes catching the scene unfolding before her. "What's going on here?" Emily's voice was firm, but not unkind. She took in the sight of the old man, the desperation etched into every line on his face. Her heart clenched with a pang of recognition, though she couldn't place why. This man was just leaving, the attendant snapped, already dismissing John as if he were nothing more than an inconvenience. Emily ignored her, stepping forward to block John's exit. "Wait," she said softly, turning her attention to him. "Have you eaten today?" John shook his head, his voice barely a whisper. "No, ma'am." Emily glanced at the attendant, her expression hardening. "I'll take care of this. Give me 2 of your best sandwiches, please." The attendant huffed but complied, wrapping up the sandwiches with a roll of her eyes. As Emily paid, she noticed a small, weathered badge pinned to John's coat. Her breath caught in her throat as she recognized the insignia, an old military badge, the same one her father used to wear before he vanished all those years ago. Handing the sandwiches to John, Emily couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to this encounter. "You served?" she asked, her voice barely masking the tremor beneath it. John nodded, accepting the food with trembling hands. "A long time ago," he replied, his eyes downcast. Emily studied him, the gears in her mind turning. There was something familiar in his posture, in the way he held himself despite his circumstances. Memories of her father flooded back, the pride in his uniform, the strength in his stance. Could it be? No, it couldn't. And yet, "Why don't you let me get you checked out?" she offered, her voice gentle but insistent. "I know a place where you can get warm, get some rest." John hesitated, the weight of pride and shame battling within him. But the warmth of her kindness, something he hadn't felt in years, melted his resistance. He nodded, barely able to meet her gaze. Emily smiled, a mix of relief and determination settling in her chest. "Come on, let's get you some help," she said, guiding him out into the cold once more. As they walked down the street together, Emily's mind raced. Who was this man really? And why did he remind her so much of the father she had lost so long ago? Emily led John through the bustling streets, her mind swirling with questions she wasn't ready to ask. The sun was low in the sky, casting long shadows over the city as they walked in silence. She could feel the weight of John's fatigue, the way he seemed to sag under the burden of his own existence. But there was something else, too, a connection she couldn't quite grasp, something familiar yet distant. They arrived at the clinic, a small, unassuming building tucked away from the main roads. It wasn't a fancy place, but it was warm and welcoming. The sign above the door read Community Health Center, and Emily felt a pang of reassurance as they stepped inside. The scent of antiseptic and clean linens greeted them, a stark contrast to the cold, harsh world outside. "Emily," called a voice from down the hall. Michael Carter, the young nurse with an easy smile and kind eyes, approached them. He was always here, always ready to help, no matter the hour. "Hey, Michael," Emily said, her tone lighter than she felt. "I've got someone who needs a little TLC." Michael's gaze shifted to John, and his expression softened with understanding. "Of course. Come on in, sir. Let's get you settled." John hesitated, glancing at Emily as if seeking her approval. She nodded, offering him a small, encouraging smile. "It's okay," she said gently. "You're in good hands." Michael guided John to an examination room while Emily lingered in the hallway, her heart pounding with unspoken thoughts. She could hear the murmur of their voices through the door, Michael's soothing tone as he asked John a series of routine questions. It was a comfort to know that John was being cared for, but the nagging feeling in her chest wouldn't leave her. After a few minutes, Michael stepped out, closing the door behind him. "He's in pretty rough shape, Emily," he said quietly, his brow furrowed with concern. "Malnourished, dehydrated, but we'll get him stabilized." Emily nodded, grateful for Michael's steady presence. "Thanks, Michael. I don't know what I would have done if I hadn't run into you tonight." He gave her a reassuring smile. "You did the right thing, bringing him here. I'll keep an eye on him tonight. Make sure he gets what he needs." As Michael headed back into the room, Emily let out a breath she didn't realize she'd been holding. She leaned against the wall, her thoughts returning to the badge on John's coat. The image of her father, strong and proud in his uniform, flashed through her mind. She had spent so many years trying to forget, trying to move on from the pain of his disappearance. But now, with John so close, those memories were rising to the surface, unbidden and relentless. She walked over to a nearby chair and sat down, her head in her hands. What if she was wrong? What if John was just another lost soul, another veteran forgotten by the world? The rational part of her mind told her it was unlikely, that the resemblance was just a coincidence. But deep down, in a place she rarely let herself go, there was hope. Hope that maybe, just maybe, she had found the one person she had given up on ever finding. The door to the examination room creaked open, and Michael reappeared. "He's resting now," he said softly, noting the tension in Emily's posture. "You should get some rest too. It's been a long day." Emily looked up, her eyes searching his for answers he didn't have. "Michael, did he say anything? Anything about his past? Where he's from?" Michael shook his head. "Not much. Just bits and pieces about his time in the service. He's been through a lot, Emily, but he's safe here. We'll take it one step at a time." She nodded, though it didn't ease the turmoil inside her. "Thanks, Michael. I'll check in tomorrow." As she stood to leave, Michael placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. "Take care of yourself, okay? This is a lot to process." Emily managed a small smile, appreciating his concern. "I will. See you tomorrow." Stepping out into the cold night, Emily wrapped her coat tighter around herself, the chill seeping into her bones. The streets were quieter now, the city settling into its nightly rhythm. But as she made her way home, her thoughts were anything but peaceful. She couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning, that bringing John to the clinic had set something in motion that she couldn't stop. The answers she sought were tantalizingly close, yet still out of reach. And as much as she wanted to believe in a reunion, she knew that the road ahead would be fraught with challenges. For now, all she could do was wait. Wait and hope that the man she had found was truly who she thought he was. The night was restless for Emily. Sleep eluded her as she lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, the day's events replaying in her mind. The image of John, frail and defeated, haunted her. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw her father's face in his, a face she had tried to remember for years, but that had always remained just out of reach. Now, it was as if that face had come back to life, worn and weathered, yet unmistakably familiar. The next morning, Emily found herself at the clinic as soon as it opened. The city was still waking up, the streets quiet except for the occasional car passing by. She pushed through the door, the smell of antiseptic and the soft hum of fluorescent lights greeting her. Michael was already there, organizing supplies at the front desk. "You're early," he remarked with a knowing smile as she approached. "Yeah," Emily replied, trying to sound casual, though she knew she wasn't fooling anyone. "I wanted to check on him." Michael nodded, understanding in his eyes. "He's still resting, but he's doing better. I managed to get him to eat a little last night, and he's rehydrated. But he's still pretty out of it, Emily. Emily's heart sank a little. She had hoped for more, but she knew this wouldn't be easy. Can I see him? Of course, Michael said, leading her down the hallway. They stopped outside the door to the room where John was staying. He's awake, but don't push him too hard, okay? He's been through a lot. Emily nodded, taking a deep breath before pushing the door open. The room was small and sparsely furnished, just a bed, a chair, and a small table by the window. John lay in the bed, propped up on pillows, his eyes staring blankly at the ceiling. His coat and the badge were folded neatly on the chair next to him. "John," Emily called softly as she stepped inside. He turned his head slowly, his gaze meeting hers. There was a flicker of recognition in his eyes, but it was quickly overshadowed by a guarded, weary look. "Morning," he muttered, his voice rough from disuse. Emily moved closer, pulling the chair up to the side of the bed. She sat down, studying him carefully. "How are you feeling?" "Better, I guess," he replied, his tone distant. He shifted uncomfortably, as if unused to being the center of attention. "I'm not sure why you're doing this, miss, but thank you." She smiled, though it didn't reach her eyes. "You don't have to thank me. I'm just glad you're safe." John nodded, though he still seemed wary. He looked down at his hands, rough and scarred, resting on the blanket. It's been a long time since someone cared enough to help. Emily felt a pang in her chest at his words. "You deserve help, John. You've done more for this country than most people ever will." He didn't respond, his gaze drifting back to the window. They sat in silence for a moment, the tension in the room thick and palpable. Finally, Emily couldn't hold it in any longer. "John, that badge you're wearing, it's from the same unit my father served in. He disappeared a long time ago, and I never found out what happened to him." Her voice trembled, but she pressed on. "When I saw you, I don't know, something just clicked. I need to know if you knew him." His name was Daniel Walker. At the mention of the name, John stiffened. His eyes flickered with something Emily couldn't quite identify. Was it recognition? Pain? Fear? He didn't answer right away, and Emily's heart began to race, her hands gripping the edge of the chair. "Daniel Walker," John repeated, his voice barely above a whisper. He closed his eyes, and for a moment, it looked as if he was struggling with a flood of emotions. Emily leaned forward, desperation creeping into her voice. "Please, John, if you know anything." John's eyes opened, filled with a sadness that seemed to weigh down his entire being. "I knew him," he said quietly. "I knew your father, Emily." Emily's breath caught in her throat. She had spent years chasing shadows, following dead ends, and now, here was the answer she had longed for, sitting right in front of her. But before she could speak, John continued, his voice thick with emotion. "We served together. He was the good man, one of the best. But things went wrong. There was a mission. We were ambushed." John's hands trembled as he spoke, his gaze distant as if reliving the memories. "I tried to save him, but I couldn't. We lost him that day. I'm sorry, Emily." The words hit her like a blow, knocking the air out of her lungs. She had always known, deep down, that her father was gone. But hearing it confirmed was like reopening an old wound that had never fully healed. Tears welled up in her eyes, but she forced herself to stay composed. "It's not your fault, John," she whispered, reaching out to place a hand over his. "You tried." John shook his head, his expression filled with regret. "I should have done more. I should have—" "No," Emily interrupted gently, squeezing his hand. "You did what you could. My father wouldn't want you to carry this burden alone." John's eyes met hers, and for the first time, she saw the walls around him begin to crack. "I've carried it for so long," he admitted, his voice breaking. "I've been lost ever since. I thought maybe if I disappeared too, it wouldn't hurt so much." Emily's heart ached for him. She had spent so many years searching for closure, and now it seemed she wasn't the only one in need of it. "You don't have to be lost anymore, John," she said softly. "We can face this together." He looked at her, a mixture of hope and uncertainty in his eyes. "I don't know if I can." "You can," Emily assured him. "We'll take it one day at a time, but you don't have to do it alone." John didn't respond, but the tension in his body seemed to ease just a little. They sat in silence for a while longer, the unspoken understanding between them growing stronger with each passing moment. For the first time in years, Emily felt a flicker of peace. It wasn't complete, and it wouldn't come easily, but it was there, a tiny spark that she would hold on to, no matter what. And as she sat there with John, she knew that they both had a long road ahead of them, but they would walk it together. The days following John's revelation passed in a blur for Emily. Each morning, she found herself at the clinic, sitting with him as he slowly regained his strength. Their conversations were often brief, filled with long silences where words seemed unnecessary. Yet in those moments of quiet, a bond was forming, a connection born from shared loss and a mutual need for healing. Michael noticed the change in John too. The once guarded man was beginning to open up, if only slightly. He ate more, rested better, and even engaged in short conversations with the nurses. The transformation was subtle, but it was there, like the first signs of spring after a long, harsh winter. One afternoon, as Emily sat by John's bedside, a thought occurred to her. She had been so focused on her father, on the answers she had been searching for, that she hadn't stopped to consider what John might need beyond the physical care he was receiving. "John," she began cautiously, unsure of how he would react. "Have you thought about what you want to do once you're well enough to leave here?" John looked at her, his brow furrowing in thought. "I haven't really thought about it," he admitted after a moment. "I don't have anywhere to go, no one waiting for me." Emily's heart ached at the loneliness in his voice. What if there was a place where you could stay? Somewhere safe, where you could start over? He frowned slightly, skepticism creeping into his eyes. "A place like that, it doesn't come free. I don't have any money, Emily." She shook her head, a small smile tugging at her lips. "I'm not talking about anything fancy. There's a veterans home in the city, not far from here. It's a good place, John. They help people get back on their feet, find work, reconnect with family." John looked away, his hands fiddling with the edge of the blanket. "I don't know if I'm ready for that," he said quietly. "I've been alone for so long. I wouldn't know how to fit in anymore." Emily reached out, gently placing her hand over his. "You don't have to decide right now, but it's something to think about. You deserve a chance to live again, to find peace." John didn't respond right away, his eyes distant as if lost in thought. Emily could see the war raging inside him. The part of him that wanted to believe in a new beginning, battling against the fear of being hurt again, of losing everything once more. Finally, he nodded, though his expression remained uncertain. "I'll think about it," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Emily smiled, relieved that he wasn't rejecting the idea outright. "That's all I ask." The conversation shifted to lighter topics after that. The weather, the goings-on at the clinic, little things that filled the space between them. But Emily's mind kept circling back to the veterans' home. She had visited it a few times in the past, volunteering on weekends when she wasn't working. It was a place filled with stories like John's, of men and women who had served their country only to be forgotten by it. As they talked, the door to the room opened, and Michael stepped in, holding a folder. "Hey, John, Emily," he greeted them with his usual warmth. "How are we doing today?" "Better," John replied, the corners of his mouth lifting in a faint smile. "Good to hear," Michael said, setting the folder down on the bedside table. "I've got your discharge papers here, John. We're going to need to find you a place to go soon." John's smile faded, replaced by the same apprehension that had been there before. "Yeah, I guess so." Michael noticed the tension and glanced at Emily, who gave him a slight nod. Emily mentioned the veterans' home. Michael continued gently. "It's a solid option, John. They'll take good care of you there." John looked between the two of them, the weight of the decision heavy in his eyes. "I don't want to be a burden," he said softly, the vulnerability in his voice catching both Emily and Michael off guard. "You're not a burden," Emily said firmly, her voice filled with conviction. "You've given so much, John. It's time someone gave something back to you." Michael nodded in agreement. "She's right, and you won't be alone there. You'll have people who understand what you've been through, people who care." For a long moment, John sat in silence, his gaze fixed on the folder in front of him. Then, with a deep breath, he nodded. "Okay," he said, his voice steady but tinged with uncertainty. "I'll go." Relief washed over Emily, and she smiled, a sense of hope swelling in her chest. "You're making the right choice, John, and I'll be there to help you every step of the way." Michael reached out, giving John's shoulder a reassuring squeeze. "We'll get everything set up. You just focus on getting stronger." As Michael left the room to make the necessary arrangements, Emily stayed by John's side, feeling the shift in the air between them. The road ahead wouldn't be easy, but it was a road they would walk together. And for the first time in years, Emily felt that maybe, just maybe, they were both on the path to healing. The next few days passed in a whirlwind of preparation. Emily worked closely with Michael to ensure that John's transition to the veterans' home would be smooth. She visited the facility herself, meeting with the staff and making sure they understood John's unique situation. They assured her that he would be welcomed and given the care he needed. But even with these reassurances, Emily couldn't shake the feeling of anxiety gnawing at her. On the morning of John's discharge, Emily arrived at the clinic early, her stomach twisting with nerves. She found herself pacing the hallway outside his room, unable to sit still. When Michael joined her, holding a set of neatly folded clothes for John, she paused, trying to gather her thoughts. "You okay?" Michael asked, his voice gentle as he handed her the clothes. "Yeah," she replied, though the word felt hollow. "I just want this to go well for him. He deserves a chance to rebuild his life." Michael smiled reassuringly. "He's got a good start, Emily. And with you by his side, he'll be fine." Emily nodded, hoping he was right. She took a deep breath, then knocked lightly on the door before pushing it open. John was sitting on the edge of the bed, staring out the window. He had changed out of the hospital gown and back into his old clothes, though they hung loosely on his frame. When he heard the door, he turned, offering Emily a tentative smile. "Morning," he greeted her, his voice calm but laced with uncertainty. "Morning, John," she replied, stepping into the room. She held up the clothes Michael had given her. "I brought these for you. I thought you might want to wear something new today." John looked at the clothes, then back at her, his expression softening. "Thank you, Emily. You've done so much for me already. I don't know how to repay you." "You don't have to repay me," she said gently, handing him the clothes. "This isn't about that. I just want to see you get better." He nodded, taking the clothes from her and holding them in his hands for a moment before standing up. "I'll change now," he said quietly, moving toward the small bathroom at the back of the room. Emily waited as he changed, her mind racing with 100 different thoughts. She wanted so badly for this to work, for John to find peace and stability at the veterans' home. But she knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy for him, or for her. The past had a way of lingering, refusing to be forgotten, and she could see that John was still haunted by it. When he emerged from the bathroom, dressed in the new clothes, Emily couldn't help but smile. The clothes fit him well, giving him a slightly more robust appearance, though he still looked tired and worn. But there was something else in his eyes, a glimmer of determination that she hadn't seen before. "You look great," Emily said, her voice filled with genuine warmth. John managed a small, grateful smile. "It feels good to have something clean to wear," he admitted, a hint of self-consciousness in his tone. Emily walked over to him, placing a comforting hand on his arm. "Let's get you to the veterans' home. They're expecting you." Together, they left the clinic, Michael giving John an encouraging nod as they passed by. The day was crisp and clear, the sun shining brightly in a cloudless sky. As they walked to Emily's car, John glanced around, his eyes taking in the world with a sense of trepidation. It had been a long time since he had ventured beyond the streets, and now he was heading into the unknown. The drive to the veterans' home was quiet, both of them lost in their own thoughts. Emily stole glances at John as they drove, watching him as he stared out the window. She could see the tension in his posture, the way his hands clenched and unclenched in his lap. Finally, they arrived at the home, a modest building surrounded by trees, with a small garden out front. It wasn't large or grand, but it was clean and welcoming, with a sense of calm that seemed to settle over the place. Emily parked the car and turned to John, who was staring at the building with a mixture of apprehension and resignation. "Ready?" she asked softly. John took a deep breath, then nodded. "As ready as I'll ever be." They stepped out of the car, and Emily led John up the path to the entrance. The doors opened automatically as they approached, and they were greeted by a friendly woman at the front desk. "Good morning," she said cheerfully. "You must be John Marshall. We've been expecting you." John gave her a polite nod, though his discomfort was clear. Emily stayed close by his side as they were led down a hallway and into a small, comfortable room. The walls were painted a soft, soothing color, and the furniture was simple but sturdy. There was a bed, a dresser, and a chair by the window, which overlooked the garden. "This will be your room," the woman explained. "We hope you'll find it comfortable. If you need anything, just let us know." John nodded again, his eyes scanning the room. "Thank you," he murmured, his voice quiet. As the woman left, Emily turned to John. "How are you feeling?" He took a moment to answer, his gaze lingering on the view outside the window. "It's nice," he finally said, his voice filled with a tentative hope. "Better than anything I've had in a long time." Emily smiled, relieved to see him settling in, even if just a little. "You'll be okay here, John, and I'll come visit as often as I can." He looked at her, his expression softening. "I'd like that. It's good to have someone who cares." "You've got a lot of people who care about you now," she replied, squeezing his arm gently. "You're not alone anymore." John nodded, a flicker of something close to gratitude in his eyes. "Thank you, Emily, for everything." She smiled, a warm, reassuring smile that she hoped would stay with him long after she left. "I'll see you soon, John. Take care." As she walked back to her car, Emily felt a strange mix of emotions. Relief that John was safe, hope that he might find a way to heal, and a lingering sadness for all the time they had both lost. But she knew that this was just the beginning. There would be more to uncover, more to face. But they had taken the first step together. And for now, that was enough. Enjoying the video? Subscribe to our channel to receive more interesting content. Click the subscribe button and stay updated with the latest news. Days turned into weeks as John settled into life at the veteran's home. Emily visited often, making sure he was adjusting and checking in with the staff about his progress. Each time she arrived, she found him in slightly better spirits, though the shadows of his past still clung to him like a persistent fog. On one such visit, as Emily walked into John's room, she noticed a small stack of letters on the bedside table. John was sitting in his usual spot by the window, a soft, contemplative look on his face. "Hey, John," she greeted him, noting the peacefulness in his demeanor. He turned to her and smiled, a genuine smile that reached his eyes. "Emily, good to see you." She gestured to the letters. "What's all this?" John looked at the letters and then back at her, a touch of pride in his voice. "I've been writing to a few old friends. People I served with, people I lost touch with over the years." Emily's heart warmed at the sight. It was the first time she had seen him take an active step toward reconnecting with his past in a positive way. "That's wonderful, John. Have you heard back from anyone?" He nodded, his expression thoughtful. "A few. It's strange hearing from them again. Some of them are doing well, others, not so much. But it feels good to reach out, to remember the good times as well as the bad." Emily sat down in the chair beside him, her eyes searching his face. "How does it feel reconnecting like this?" John was silent for a moment, his gaze drifting out the window. "It's hard," he admitted. "There's a lot of pain there, a lot of memories I've tried to bury. But it's also healing in a way. It's like putting the pieces of myself back together." Emily felt a surge of hope for him. "I'm glad you're doing this, John. You're not just surviving anymore. You're living." He smiled at her, a soft, grateful smile. "I wouldn't have been able to do it without you, Emily. You've done more for me than anyone ever has." She shook her head, her voice filled with sincerity. "You've done the hard work, John. I'm just here to support you." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, the quiet hum of the home surrounding them. The weight of the past still lingered, but it was less oppressive now, less suffocating. John was beginning to find his way, and Emily felt a deep sense of fulfillment in knowing she had played a part in that. As the sun dipped lower in the sky, casting a warm glow over the room, Emily finally spoke. "John, I've been thinking." He turned to her, his expression curious. "What about?" She hesitated, choosing her words carefully. "About the future. About what's next for you." John's brow furrowed slightly, the old wariness returning. I'm not sure I'm ready to think about that yet. I understand, Emily said gently. But I want you to know that whatever you decide, I'll be here for you. Whether it's staying here, moving somewhere new, or even finding a way to work again, I'll support you. John looked at her, his eyes searching hers for any sign of doubt. When he found none, he relaxed, nodding slowly. I appreciate that, Emily. I really do. Take your time, she encouraged. There's no rush, but just know that you have options. You have a future. John nodded again, though the uncertainty was still there. I'll think about it. As they continued to talk, the conversation turned to lighter topics, and Emily found herself smiling and laughing more than she had in a long time. The bond between them had grown stronger, forged in the fires of shared pain and the slow, steady process of healing. When it was time for Emily to leave, she stood by the door, looking back at John with a mixture of pride and affection. Take care, John. I'll see you soon. He smiled, the expression full of gratitude. I'll be here. As Emily walked down the hall, she felt a sense of peace settle over her. John was healing, step by step, day by day. And though there were still challenges ahead, she knew they would face them together. For the first time in years, the future didn't seem so daunting. It seemed almost hopeful. The weeks continued to pass, and with each visit, Emily noticed more changes in John. He was becoming more engaged, more present. The once frail, broken man she had met in the bakery was slowly but surely finding his footing again. The letters he had sent out were beginning to bear fruit. Responses trickled in, reconnecting him with people from his past. And with each letter, a piece of John's old self seemed to return. One afternoon, as Emily walked into John's room, she found him deep in conversation with another resident, a tall man with silver hair and a booming voice. They were laughing, a sound that caught her by surprise. "Emily," John called out as he saw her, his face lighting up with a smile that was becoming more frequent these days. "Come meet Frank. He served in the same unit I did, just a few years before me." Frank turned and gave Emily a warm smile, his handshake firm. "So you're the one who's been looking after this old soldier," he said with a wink. "John here speaks very highly of you." Emily returned the smile, feeling a surge of pride. "It's been a privilege to get to know him. I'm glad to see him reconnecting with old friends." Frank chuckled, clapping John on the back. "We've been sharing stories all morning. It's good to remember the old days, especially with someone who understands." John nodded, his expression thoughtful. "It's like putting on an old pair of boots. They might be worn, but they fit just right." The three of them spent the afternoon together, the conversation flowing easily. Emily listened as John and Frank shared stories of their time in the service, some humorous, others tinged with sadness. It was clear that these memories, though painful, were an essential part of who John was, and sharing them was helping him heal. As the sun began to set, Frank excused himself, leaving Emily and John alone. The room was bathed in the warm, golden light of the late afternoon, casting long shadows on the walls. "You seem happy, John," Emily remarked, a soft smile on her face. John nodded, his gaze fixed on the horizon outside the window. "I am," he said quietly. "For the first time in a long time, I feel like I'm starting to find myself again." Emily felt her heart swell with emotion. "You've come so far, John. I'm proud of you." He turned to her, his eyes filled with gratitude. "I couldn't have done it without you, Emily. You gave me hope when I had none left." She reached out and took his hand, squeezing it gently. "You did the hard part, John. I just reminded you of who you are." They sat in silence for a moment, the weight of their journey together hanging in the air. Emily could see the strength returning to John, the resilience that had carried him through so many battles now helping him fight for his future. "I've been thinking about what you said," John began, his voice steady but contemplative. "About the future, about what's next." Emily's heart skipped a beat. She had been waiting for this moment, hoping that John would reach it in his own time. "What are you thinking?" He took a deep breath, his eyes meeting hers with a newfound resolve. "I want to start working again, Emily. I know it won't be easy, and I'm not as strong as I used to be, but I need to feel useful. I need a purpose." Emily's smile grew, her eyes shining with pride. "I think that's a wonderful idea, John. and I know just the place." He raised an eyebrow, curiosity piqued. "Oh, there's a local Veterans Outreach Center," she explained. "They're always looking for people to help out. It's not physically demanding, but it's important work, helping other veterans get the support they need." John considered this, the idea clearly resonating with him. "Helping others like me," he mused, his voice thoughtful. "That sounds like something I could do." "You'd be perfect for it," Emily encouraged. "You've been through so much, and you could really make a difference in someone else's life. Just like you've made a difference in mine." John's gaze softened, a look of deep appreciation in his eyes. "I'd like that, Emily. I'd like to give back, to do something meaningful." "Then it's settled," she said with a grin. "I'll talk to the director of the center and get things started. You're going to be amazing at this, John." He smiled, the expression full of a quiet confidence that had been absent for so long. "Thank you, Emily, for everything." As they sat together, watching the sun dip below the horizon, Emily felt a sense of peace wash over her. John was finding his way back step by step, and now he had a purpose to guide him. The journey was far from over, but they were on the right path, and that was all that mattered. For the first time in years, Emily could see a future for both of them, a future filled with hope, healing, and the promise of new beginnings. The morning was bright and crisp as Emily pulled up to the Veterans Outreach Center, the building a modest but welcoming presence in the middle of a bustling neighborhood. She had called ahead and spoken to the director, who was more than eager to meet John and see how he could contribute. As she stepped out of the car, Emily felt a mixture of excitement and nervousness, hoping that this next step would be the right one for John. John was waiting for her at the entrance to the veteran's home, dressed in the new clothes she had bought for him weeks ago. He looked different now, more confident, more sure of himself. The transformation had been gradual but undeniable. As Emily approached, she noticed a slight smile on his face, one that carried a trace of anticipation. "Ready?" she asked as she reached him, her tone light but encouraging. John nodded, his gaze steady. "I'm ready." They got into the car and drove the short distance to the outreach center, the conversation between them easy and relaxed. John seemed more at ease than Emily had seen him in a long time, as if he had finally begun to shake off the weight of his past. When they arrived at the center, John hesitated for a moment, his eyes scanning the building as if taking in every detail. Emily could see the flicker of anxiety in his expression, the nerves that still lingered beneath the surface. She reached over and gently touched his arm, offering him a reassuring smile. "You've got this, John," she said softly. "Just be yourself." He took a deep breath and nodded, the tension in his shoulders easing slightly. "Yeah, I can do this." They walked into the center together, the interior warm and inviting, with walls adorned with photographs of veterans from all walks of life. A sense of community permeated the air, a feeling that Emily hoped would help John feel at home. The director, a kind-eyed woman named Teresa, greeted them with a welcoming smile. "You must be John Marshall," she said, extending her hand. "It's a pleasure to meet you." John shook her hand, his grip firm but not overbearing. "Likewise, ma'am. Thank you for considering me." Teresa waved off the formality with a smile. "Please call me Teresa. We're all on the same team here." She turned to Emily, her smile widening. "And you must be Emily. I've heard a lot about you." Emily blushed slightly, but returned the smile. "All good things, I hope." "Absolutely," Teresa replied, her tone warm. She gestured toward a hallway leading deeper into the building. "Why don't I give you both a tour of the center? I can show you where we need the most help, and you can get a feel for the place, John." They followed Teresa down the hallway, passing by several rooms filled with activity. In one room, a group of veterans was gathered around a table, deep in discussion. In another, volunteers were organizing supplies and packing care packages to be sent to those still serving overseas. The center buzzed with a quiet energy, a sense of purpose that was palpable. As they walked, Teresa explained the various programs the center offered. "We focus on providing support for veterans in all aspects of their lives, whether it's finding housing, securing employment, or just having a place to connect with others who understand what they've been through. We're always looking for volunteers who can relate to our members, people who've walked the same path." John listened intently, his eyes absorbing everything around him. "It's impressive," he said finally, his voice tinged with admiration. "You're doing a lot of good here." Teresa smiled, her eyes softening. "We try, but we could always use more help, especially from someone with your experience." They reached a small office at the end of the hallway, where Teresa paused and turned to face John. "This could be your space if you're interested. We need someone who can help with outreach, someone who can talk to veterans about their needs and connect them with the resources we offer. It's not an easy job, but it's one of the most important." John glanced at Emily, a silent question in his eyes. She nodded encouragingly, her heart swelling with pride. "You'd be perfect for this, John." He looked back at Teresa, his expression thoughtful. "I'm willing to give it a try," he said, his voice steady. "I want to help." Teresa's smile widened, her relief evident. "I'm glad to hear that, John. I think you'll make a real difference here." They spent the next hour going over the details of the role, with Teresa explaining the daily responsibilities and introducing John to some of the other staff members. Emily watched as John interacted with everyone, noting the way he seemed to slip into the role naturally. There was still a hint of the old wariness in his eyes, but it was overshadowed by a growing confidence, a sense of belonging that had been absent for so long. By the time they left the center, the sun was high in the sky, casting a warm glow over the neighborhood. John walked beside Emily, a quiet contentment radiating from him. "How do you feel?" Emily asked as they reached the car. John took a moment to respond, his eyes distant as he processed everything. "I feel good," he said finally, a small smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "For the first time in a long time, I feel like I'm moving forward." Emily smiled, the relief and joy in her chest almost overwhelming. "I knew you'd find your way, John. You just needed a little push." He chuckled softly, the sound warm and genuine. "Yeah, I guess I did, but I couldn't have done it without you, Emily. You've been there for me every step of the way." She reached out and squeezed his hand, her voice filled with emotion. "And I always will be, John. We're in this together." They drove back to the veterans' home in comfortable silence, the weight of the past slowly lifting from their shoulders. John had found a new purpose, a reason to keep moving forward, and Emily knew that this was just the beginning. As they pulled up to the home, John turned to her, his expression serious but hopeful. "Thank you, Emily, for everything." She smiled, her eyes shining with pride and affection. "You don't need to thank me, John. Just keep going. Keep living." He nodded, his resolve clear. "I will." And as they said their goodbyes, Emily couldn't help but feel that they had both turned a corner, stepping into a future that, for the first time in years, felt full of possibility. The weeks that followed were a time of growth and change for John. Each morning, he woke up with a renewed sense of purpose, no longer haunted by the past, but instead focused on the present and the future. His work at the Veterans Outreach Center had quickly become a source of pride and fulfillment, a way for him to give back to those who had shared similar experiences. The once aimless days now had structure, and the loneliness that had once consumed him was gradually being replaced by a sense of belonging. Emily continued to visit him regularly, though their roles were beginning to shift. Where once she had been the one guiding and supporting him, now she found herself standing back, watching as John navigated his new life with growing confidence. She was still there for him, still a constant presence in his life, but it was clear that he was finding his own way. One sunny afternoon, Emily arrived at the Outreach Center to find John deep in conversation with a group of veterans. They were sitting around a large table, discussing housing options and employment opportunities. John was speaking with an authority and ease that she hadn't seen in him before, his voice steady as he offered advice and shared his own experiences. She waited by the doorway, not wanting to interrupt. It was a powerful thing to witness. The transformation of a man who had once been lost, now helping others find their way. There was a quiet strength in John now, a resilience that had been forged through years of struggle and pain, but had emerged as something powerful and unbreakable. As the meeting wrapped up, John looked up and noticed Emily standing there. A smile broke across his face, and he waved her over. "Emily, come meet the guys." She approached the table, returning his smile. "Hey everyone, "I'm Emily." The men around the table greeted her warmly, their camaraderie evident. One of them, a tall, muscular man with a beard, grinned at her. "We've heard a lot about you. John here talks about you all the time." Emily blushed slightly, but laughed. "All good things, I hope." "Only the best," John replied with a wink, his tone light and teasing. They spent the next few minutes chatting, the conversation flowing easily. Emily could see how well John had integrated himself into the community at the center. He was respected, his opinions valued, and it was clear that he had found his place among these men. After a while, the group dispersed, leaving Emily and John alone. They walked outside, where the late afternoon sun cast a warm glow over the city. The center's garden was in full bloom, a riot of colors that seemed to mirror the vibrancy of the life John was building for himself. "You looked really happy in there," Emily remarked as they strolled along the garden path. "I am," John admitted, his voice steady and sincere. "It's been a long time since I felt this way. Like I'm actually making a difference." "You are making a difference," Emily assured him, her tone filled with pride. "You're helping so many people, John. I always knew you could do it." He glanced at her, his expression thoughtful. "You believed in me when I didn't believe in myself. I don't think I'll ever be able to thank you enough for that." Emily shook her head, smiling softly. "You don't need to thank me. Just seeing you like this, knowing you're happy and doing well, that's all the thanks I need." They reached a bench at the edge of the garden and sat down, the peacefulness of the moment settling over them. The sound of birds chirping in the trees above, the distant hum of the city, and the warmth of the sun on their skin created a sense of serenity that was almost tangible. John was quiet for a moment, his gaze distant as if lost in thought. When he spoke again, his voice was low, almost hesitant. "I've been thinking a lot lately, Emily, about the future." Emily turned to him, her heart quickening slightly. "What about it?" He sighed, running a hand through his hair. "About where I go from here. I've come so far, but there's still a lot I need to figure out." "You've already come a long way," Emily said gently. "But it's okay to take things one step at a time. You don't have to have everything figured out all at once." John nodded, though the uncertainty remained in his eyes. "I know, but there's something else, something I haven't told you." Emily felt a pang of concern, but kept her voice calm. "What is it, John?" He hesitated, as if struggling to find the right words. "I've been thinking about my family," he said finally, his voice tinged with regret. "About the people I left behind when I disappeared." Emily's heart tightened, understanding the weight of what he was saying. "Do you want to try to find them?" John looked at her, his expression filled with a mixture of hope and fear. "I'm not sure. I don't even know if they'd want to see me after all this time. But I can't help wondering if they're out there, if they're okay." Emily reached out and took his hand, offering him a reassuring squeeze. "If that's something you want to do, I'll help you. You don't have to do it alone." John's eyes softened, gratitude shining through the uncertainty. "Thank you, Emily. I don't know what I'd do without you." "You won't ever have to find out," she said with a warm smile. "We'll take it one step at a time, just like we always have." They sat in silence for a while longer, the sun slowly sinking below the horizon, casting long shadows over the garden. The path ahead was still uncertain, but for the first time, John wasn't afraid to face it. With Emily by his side, he felt like he could confront whatever came next, no matter how difficult. And as the sky darkened and the first stars began to twinkle above, John knew that the journey was far from over. But this time, he wasn't walking it alone. He had found his way back to the world, and now, with Emily's support, he was ready to face whatever the future held. The next few days were a whirlwind of emotions for John. The idea of reconnecting with his family, of facing the people he had left behind so many years ago, was both exhilarating and terrifying. The memories of his past, long buried under layers of guilt and shame, were beginning to resurface, forcing him to confront the choices he had made and the consequences that had followed. Emily, as always, was by his side, offering her unwavering support. She knew how much this decision weighed on him, and she made sure he knew that whatever happened, he wasn't alone. Together, they began the painstaking process of searching for any information about John's family, using the resources available at the Veterans Outreach Center and reaching out to various organizations that specialized in reconnecting families. One afternoon, as they sat in the quiet of John's room at the veteran's home, Emily received a phone call that would change everything. The woman on the other end of the line spoke calmly, but the news she delivered was anything but ordinary. After weeks of searching, they had finally found a lead, a possible connection to John's long-lost daughter. Emily hung up the phone, her heart racing. She turned to John, who was watching her with a mixture of hope and dread. "John," she began, her voice trembling slightly. "They found something. It's not a lot, but it's a start." John's breath caught in his throat, and for a moment, he couldn't speak. "What did they find?" he finally managed to ask, his voice barely above a whisper. "They found a woman named Sarah Marshall," Emily said, carefully choosing her words. "She's in her early 30s, lives a few hours away. The timeline and details match up. It could be your daughter." John's hands trembled as he absorbed the information. He had spent so many years convincing himself that his family was lost to him, that he would never have the chance to make things right. And now, the possibility of seeing his daughter again, of explaining everything, was suddenly within reach. "What do I do?" he asked, his voice raw with emotion. "What if she doesn't want to see me?" Emily moved closer, her eyes filled with compassion. "I can't promise that everything will go the way you want it to, John. But I do know that if you don't try, you'll always wonder what could have been. This is your chance to make amends, to show her the man you've become." John nodded, though the fear in his eyes was still palpable. "How do I even start? What do I say to her?" Emily smiled gently. "Just be honest. Tell her the truth, and let her see that you've changed. She may have questions, and it might be difficult, but you'll get through it together." The decision was made that night. With Emily's help, John wrote a letter to Sarah, explaining who he was and why he had disappeared all those years ago. He poured his heart into the letter, admitting his mistakes and expressing his deepest regret for the pain he had caused. He ended the letter with a simple request, that she give him a chance to explain, to reconnect if she was willing. The letter was sent the next day, and the waiting began. Each day felt like an eternity as John anxiously checked for a response, his emotions swinging between hope and despair. Emily stayed close by, offering words of comfort and encouragement, but she knew that this was something John had to face on his own. Finally, after what felt like a lifetime, a letter arrived. The envelope was simple, unassuming, but as soon as John saw it, he knew. His hands shook as he opened it, and for a moment, he couldn't bring himself to read the words inside. Emily sat beside him, her hand on his arm, offering silent support. "Take your time," she whispered. "Whatever it says, we'll face it together." John nodded, then took a deep breath and began to read. The letter was short, but every word carried a weight that was almost too much to bear. Sarah had received his letter, and she had been shocked, to say the least. She had spent most of her life believing that her father had abandoned her, and the sudden reappearance of his name had brought back a flood of old wounds. But despite the pain, she had written back. She needed time to process everything, she said, but she was open to the possibility of meeting him, of hearing his side of the story. She didn't make any promises, and there were no guarantees, but the door was open. John's hands shook as he finished reading, tears streaming down his face. "She's willing to see me," he whispered, as if he couldn't quite believe it. "She's willing to give me a chance." Emily's eyes filled with tears as well, and she reached out to hug him. "I'm so proud of you, John. This is the first step." The days that followed were filled with a nervous anticipation as they made arrangements for the meeting. John was a bundle of nerves, his mind racing with 1,000 possibilities. But Emily was there to steady him, to remind him that he was doing the right thing. When the day finally arrived, they drove to the small town where Sarah lived. The car ride was mostly silent, each of them lost in their own thoughts. John's anxiety was palpable, but there was also a quiet determination in his eyes, a resolve to face whatever came next. They pulled up to a small, modest house on the outskirts of town. John hesitated for a moment, his hand on the car door, before finally opening it and stepping out. Emily followed, staying close but giving him the space he needed. As they approached the front door, It opened slowly, and there she was. Sarah stood in the doorway, a woman in her early 30s, with the same eyes that John had once seen in the mirror. For a moment, they simply stared at each other, the air thick with emotion. "Dad!" Sarah's voice was tentative, unsure, as if she was testing the word for the first time in years. John's heart clenched, and he felt tears welling up in his eyes. "Sarah," he breathed, taking a step forward. "I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry for everything." She didn't move, her eyes searching his face for something familiar, something real. Then, slowly, she stepped forward and wrapped her arms around him. "I don't know if I can forgive you," she whispered, her voice trembling. "But I want to try." John hugged her tightly, his tears falling freely. "That's all I can ask for," he said, his voice choked with emotion. "Thank you, Sarah. Thank you for giving me a chance." As they stood there, holding onto each other for the first time in decades, Emily watched from a distance, her heart swelling with pride and relief. She knew that this was just the beginning, that there would be many challenges ahead. But for now, they had found each other. And that was enough. The days after John's reunion with Sarah were a mixture of emotions that neither of them had fully anticipated. The initial relief and joy of finding each other again quickly gave way to the realization that rebuilding a relationship fractured by decades of absence would be anything but simple. There were moments of awkwardness, where words seemed to fail them, leaving only the heavy silence of years lost. But there were also moments of connection, where shared memories and mutual understanding began to bridge the gap between them. John spent more and more time in Sarah's town, often staying in a small guest room she had set up for him in her home. It wasn't much, just a bed, a dresser, and a few family photos on the walls. But it was more than John had dared to hope for. Sarah had made it clear that she needed time to adjust, and while the arrangement was temporary, it was a start. Emily visited occasionally, making sure to give them the space they needed, but always available if John needed support. She could see the progress they were making, slow and tentative as it was. Sarah was guarded, understandably so, but there was a softness in her eyes when she looked at John that hadn't been there at first. One afternoon, as John and Sarah sat on the porch of her house, watching the sun set over the distant hills, Sarah finally broke the silence that had hung between them all day. "I was angry at you for so long," she admitted, her voice low but steady. "When you left, I didn't understand. I thought you didn't care about us, about me." John's heart ached at her words, the weight of his past mistakes pressing down on him. "I didn't mean to hurt you, Sarah," he said quietly, his voice thick with regret. "I thought I was doing the right thing by staying away. I was lost, broken. I didn't think I had anything to offer you. But I was wrong. I should have been there for you, and I'm so sorry that I wasn't." Sarah nodded, her expression thoughtful. "I've had a lot of time to think about it, too. I used to tell myself that I didn't need you, that I was better off without you. But the truth is, I missed you every day. I just didn't want to admit it." John reached out and gently took her hand, his eyes searching hers for some sign of forgiveness. "I missed you too, Sarah. Every single day. Not a moment went by that I didn't think about you, wonder how you were doing. I was a coward for running away, and I'll spend the rest of my life trying to make it up to you if you'll let me." Sarah squeezed his hand, her grip firm and reassuring. "I want to try, Dad. I want us to have a relationship, even if it's not the one we might have had if things had been different. But I need you to be honest with me about everything. No more hiding, no more running away." John nodded, his eyes misting with tears. "I promise, Sarah. No more hiding. You deserve the truth, and I'll do whatever it takes to earn your trust." They sat together in silence for a while, watching the sky turn shades of pink and orange as the sun dipped below the horizon. There was still so much to say, so much to work through, but for the first time, they were facing it together. The days turned into weeks, and slowly, the walls between them began to come down. Sarah started to ask more questions about John's past, about the years he had spent away from her. John answered as honestly as he could, sharing the parts of his life that he had kept buried for so long. It was painful reliving those memories, but it was also cathartic. He could see the understanding in Sarah's eyes as she listened, and it gave him hope that they could heal together. One evening, as they sat in the living room after dinner, Sarah brought out an old photo album. It was worn and tattered, the edges frayed from years of use, but the photos inside were well preserved. She opened it to a page filled with pictures from her childhood, birthdays, family vacations, moments frozen in time. "This was my 7th birthday," she said, pointing to a picture of herself as a little girl, grinning widely as she held up a doll. "Mom made that cake. It was my favorite, chocolate with strawberry frosting." John smiled sadly, remembering the little girl he had left behind. "You look so happy," he said softly. "I was," Sarah replied, her voice tinged with nostalgia. "But I remember wishing you were there. Every birthday, every Christmas, I always wished you'd walk through the door and surprise us." John's heart clenched at her words, the guilt and regret almost overwhelming. "I'm sorry I wasn't there, Sarah. I can't change the past, but I want to be there for you now, for everything." Sarah looked at him, her eyes filled with a mix of emotions. "I know you do, Dad, and I want that too, but it's going to take time." "I understand," John said, his voice steady. "I'll wait as long as it takes. Just having you in my life again is more than I ever hoped for." They continued to look through the album, sharing memories and stories. As they talked, the distance between them began to shrink, replaced by a growing bond that was slowly, but surely, being rebuilt. It wasn't perfect, and there were still moments of tension and uncertainty, but it was a start. And as the weeks turned into months, John and Sarah found themselves creating new memories together. They went for walks, cooked meals, and spent quiet evenings on the porch, talking about everything and nothing. The past still lingered, but it no longer held them captive. They were moving forward, step by step, learning how to be a family again. One evening, as they sat together watching the stars, Sarah turned to John with a thoughtful expression. "I've been thinking," she began, her voice hesitant, "about Mom." John's breath caught in his throat, and he nodded, encouraging her to continue. "I think we should visit her grave together," Sarah said quietly. "I've gone alone for so many years, but I think it's time we go together, to say goodbye, and to start fresh." John's eyes filled with tears, and he reached out to take her hand. "I'd like that, Sarah. I think it's time to." And so, a few days later, they made the trip to the cemetery where Sarah's mother was buried. It was a solemn journey, filled with emotion, but as they stood together by the graveside, John felt a sense of peace wash over him. He hadn't been there for Sarah when she needed him most, but now he was determined to make up for it, to be the father she deserved. As they left the cemetery that day, John knew that they had turned a corner. The road ahead would still be challenging, but they were walking it together side by side. And for the first time in years, John felt like he was truly home. We hope you were moved and inspired by our story. We want to hear your opinion. Leave a comment below. Share your impressions and your own stories of resilience and hope. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel so you don't miss our next emotional videos. Join us on this journey and follow more incredible stories. See you next time.